I remember that afternoon with the clarity reserved for moments in which nothing happens, and yet everything quietly tilts. I had wandered into St. Fritzwide's almost by instinct, though instinct is a word I've never trusted. The wind had pushed a scatter of golden leaves along the quad, giving the sense of an argument already underway between the trees and the season, and I found myself taking the steps to the old lecture hall before I decided to go anywhere at all. There was a notice pinned to the door about a final lecture in logic by the venerable Professor Armitage. I had never been one of his students, but Oxford has a way of convincing a man that unfinished intellectual debts can appear decades late. The hall was nearly empty. A pair of earnest undergraduates sat together with expressions too bright for November, and an elderly man with hair like thinning cotton seemed to be sleeping before the lecture even began. I slipped into a seat halfway up, grateful for the anonymity that the gloom of old wood often provides. The air had that faint scent of chalk dust and forgotten arguments, and for a brief moment I felt the old tug of something close to longing. Armitage began without ceremony. His voice was softer than I expected, a cracked instrument carrying the fragments of a mind that had once been quick enough to intimidate his peers. He spoke of proofs and paradoxes, of the seductions of elegance, of the way a single assumption can bend the entire structure of an idea. I found myself drifting, mapping his words onto the half-finished crossword I had left on my breakfast table. The clue that had bothered me all morning surfaced again. Deduction betrayed 6 letters. I hadn't filled it in. I had a suspicion, but the symmetry of the grid resisted me. Several times, Armitage's phrases rang oddly in my ears. There was a precision too deliberate, as though the professor had chosen each word not for clarity, but for secrecy. I've learned to distrust language when it becomes too perfect. It reminded me of a suspect rehearsing an alibi, the sentences polished to a shine that reveals the fingerprints beneath. At one point he said that truth becomes bearable only when trimmed of its loose ends. I noted it mentally. No academic with a conscience would say such a thing casually. It was during a pause, when Armitage leaned on the lectern and stared at a point somewhere above our heads, that I realized I had seen a face in the doorway. A porter in the college uniform, cap slightly askew, eyes fixed not on the lecturer but on the rows of seats. His gaze rested on me for an instant too long. Then he disappeared as though the corridor had swallowed him whole. Most would have dismissed it as curiosity. I've learned that curiosity in Oxford is rarely harmless. The lecture ended without applause. The undergraduates hurried out arm in arm, already discussing the moral implications of a paradox they had misunderstood. The sleeping man woke with a gentle snort and shuffled down the aisle. I waited until the hall was nearly empty before making my way to the exit, but something made me pause at the doorway. A slip of paper had fallen near the first row. I bent down and picked it up, a stanza of a poem written in a hand steadier than the age of the ink suggested. The rhyme stumbled in the second line as though the writer had wanted it to fall out of step. I put it in my pocket without thinking. Some habits cling to a detective long after formality has worn thin. Outside, the air had sharpened. Rain tapped at the stone like an impatient visitor, and I found myself crossing the quad with a sense of unfinished business. I had barely reached the gate when Lewis called. His voice arrived through the receiver in that quiet way of his, as though he feared disturbing the world too much. There had been a body found by the river, he told me. A porter, apparently. Misadventure was the whispered conclusion, though no one seemed satisfied with the term. Something inside me settled with a kind of grim inevitability. The face from the doorway returned with unwelcome clarity. The heavy eyes, the hesitant posture, the fleeting plea in the look he gave me. I felt the weight of the poem in my pocket. A small clue, perhaps, or nothing at all, but the grid of my crossword flickered into mind again, the clue that refused to yield. Deduction betrayed. 6 letters. and though I had no evidence then, I already knew the answer would not bring comfort. I arrived at St. Fridswide's the next morning with that familiar sense of stepping into a place that would rather I stayed outside. Colleges often tolerate policemen the way scholars tolerate drafts through ancient windows, something to be endured only when necessary. The porter's death had unsettled them more than they cared to admit, yet not enough to offer anything as vulgar as transparency. Even the sky had taken on a tone of guarded silence, a grey that pressed itself low over the roofs as though it wished not to intrude. Lewis walked beside me, his steps steady, his gaze already sweeping the quad for the details I tended to overlook in moments of private rumination. He told me quietly that a fellow had asked for a discreet second look at the circumstances of the porter's drowning. He didn't say the fellow's name at first. People rarely do when they fear they might be the next to speak too openly. It was only when we paused outside the lodge that he added that the request had come from someone who preferred not to be seen speaking to the police. That told me more than the name could. The college lawns glistened faintly from a night of soft rain. Curtains in several windows remained stubbornly closed, as if each room concealed secrets too fragile to survive daylight. Oxford has always been a city that hides its stories behind panes of glass, but St. Fridswide's seemed to have perfected the art. I felt again the weight of the poem in my notebook, the rhyme that fell out of step as though some truth had been shaken loose. Inside the lodge, the new porter, a younger man with anxious hands, gave us a careful nod. He spoke with the caution of someone who had been instructed to say as little as possible. His version of events was clean, brief, and unmistakably rehearsed. The dead porter, he said, had been dutiful, quiet, reliable, a man who troubled no one. Yet the bursar, when we found him shuffling papers in his dim office, remarked with a strained smile that the porter had grown too inquisitive for his position. A contradiction, slight but telling. I have learned to trust such fractures in the veneer. They are the first signs of a hidden structure beneath. Lewis noted the inconsistency on the small pad he always carried, though I could see he sensed my mind drifting elsewhere. Something had caught my attention on the bursar's desk, a ledger open to a page where the ink had bled slightly, as though corrected in haste. A donation recorded, crossed out, recorded again. I didn't yet know why it troubled me, only that it did. Small errors, like misplaced letters in a crossword, often hinted at something concealed beneath the surface. We made our way to the college library next. The building had the quiet dignity of a chapel that had forgotten it was meant for worship. The scent of old paper drifted through the aisles, curling up like memory. A librarian, tall and thin as a quill, greeted us with polite disapproval. He spoke softly of the porter's habit of borrowing books he had no reason to borrow. Curiosity again. Too much of it. I watched the man's fingers trace the spines with a tremor that contradicted his calm voice. It was there, between two shelves of antiquated treatises, that I noticed an inscription in a volume of logical essays. A line of Latin, elegant in form, had been struck through with unnecessary force. Someone had not wanted it read, though the rest of the text remained untouched. The aggression of the stroke jarred against the civility of the surroundings. I copied it down, translating it later in my head. When truth threatens comfort, comfort prevails. A sentiment Armitage might have appreciated, though I doubted he was the one who had crossed it out. Lewis asked if I thought the porter had stumbled upon something he shouldn't have. I told him that people rarely drown by accident after learning something they're not meant to know. He nodded, though there was a furrow in his brow that suggested he preferred the simpler explanations I could no longer bring myself to trust. As we stepped back onto the quad, a gust of wind pressed against the library doors, making them shift with a low, wooden groan. It sounded almost like a warning. Curtains in an upper window fluttered, then closed as though someone had realized they'd allowed too much light in. I paused, feeling the faintest echo of unease settle in my chest. The elegance of Armitage's lecture, the hesitant poem, the anxious gazes. They were not part of separate stories. They were threads of the same tapestry, though the pattern remained elusive. Lewis asked what I was thinking. I told him nothing useful, which was true and not true at once. A detail had begun to stir at the edge of my memory, something small and easily dismissed, yet persistent. A misplaced word in the professor's lecture, perhaps, or the way the porter had looked at me in the doorway, as though seeking someone who might understand a message he couldn't bring himself to deliver. Oxford held its breath around us, waiting for something to be uncovered. But truth, I found, rarely opens its curtains willingly. I went to see Armitage the following afternoon, though I told myself it was simply to clarify something about his lecture. That was the lie detectives often tell themselves, that curiosity is professional rather than personal. The truth was that the porter's face, that fleeting troubled glance in the doorway, had stayed with me longer than reason allowed. And Armitage, with his murmured aphorisms and strangely deliberate diction, felt like the place where those threads might first begin to knot. His rooms occupied a narrow corner of the senior fellows' building, a part of the college that always smelled faintly of old rugs and older disappointments. The staircase groaned under my weight, each step complaining softly in that way Wood does after decades of bearing academic burdens. When I knocked, the answer came not as a voice, but as the scrape of a chair, followed by a sigh that suggested he had been expecting an interruption long before I arrived. Armitage looked smaller without the lectern in front of him. His spine curved inward as though memory or regret had pressed down on him for years. Papers were scattered across his desk in a pattern only he understood. They formed little islands of ink and half-formed arguments. He gestured for me to sit, though he did not bother to hide the unease that flickered across his eyes. He asked me what I wanted, and I heard the fatigue behind the question. I told him I had found his lecture intriguing. That was true enough, though intriguing was the wrong word. Unsettling would have been closer. He nodded, tapping one bony finger on a stack of handwritten notes. Unfinished work, he muttered. Pages he had not yet decided whether to burn or revise. He said it lightly, but I sensed the weight behind it. There was something in the air of that cluttered room that felt not quite like secrecy, but like an apology that had never found the courage to surface. He spoke of logic as a dying art. Students, he said, had grown more interested in fashionable theories than in the discipline of thought. His voice drifted as he talked, rising and falling like a man recalling a lost companion. At times, he seemed to forget I was there. At others, he studied me with a sharpness that made the room feel smaller. I asked about the porter, though I phrased it as an aside. Had he known him? Only in passing, he replied. A diligent man. Helpful. Then came a pause too long to be casual, followed by a carefully delivered remark about boundaries. Staff should not involve themselves in academic affairs. It was delivered with the tone of someone who had given the warning before. As he spoke, my eyes drifted to a notebook half buried beneath a manuscript. A page stuck out just far enough to show a single line of writing in a steady hand. Elegance is the refuge of cowards. A strange sentiment for a logician. I reached toward it before I realized I was doing so. Armitage's reaction was small but telling. A tremor in his jaw, a tightening of his shoulders. He slid the notebook further under the papers with a movement so subtle he might have believed I wouldn't notice. That was my moment of deduction. Quiet, private, almost imperceptible. He wasn't hiding his past, he was hiding his present. Something unfinished lived in that notebook, something he feared might outlast him if left in the wrong hands. He changed the subject abruptly, asking if I enjoyed crosswords. The question was too pointed to be random. I told him I did. He murmured that puzzles were the only honest form of human conversation, every clue a confession, every answer a retreat. Then he gave a half-smile, thin and brittle. "Some clues are better left unanswered," he said, as though rehearsing a line meant for a different audience. I left his rooms with a sensation I couldn't quite articulate. The corridors outside were dim, the air humming faintly with the distant rattle of pipes. As I passed a row of portraits, I noticed one frame slightly crooked, the only imperfection in an otherwise obsessive alignment. I straightened it without thinking. Behind it, a faint mark on the wall suggested it had been taken down recently and replaced in haste. A trivial detail, perhaps, but the case was already whispering to me through its smallest inconsistencies. Lewis found me emerging into the quad. He asked if the professor had been helpful. I told him that Armitage had given me nothing of substance. That was true, and entirely false. Something in those unread pages, those carefully obscured manuscripts, held the shape of a confession not yet spoken aloud. Oxford's evening light softened the stone around us. Curtains remained closed across the windows of the fellows' rooms, and I walked away with the uneasy certainty that I had just spoken with a man trying, in his quiet, scholarly way, to bury himself before someone else could do it for him. I've often thought that suspects rarely introduce themselves as such. They appear instead as variations in a minor key, a shift in tone, a hesitation, an unfinished sentence that lingers like a low note on a cello. At St. Friddeswide's, those notes gathered around me with an almost musical inevitability, each person offering a different cadence of unease. The college seemed to breathe them out as naturally as it exhaled the smell of damp stone. Lewis and I began with Dr. Helena Markham. Her rooms overlooked the quad, though the curtains were drawn tight against the afternoon gloom. She let us in with the quiet assurance of someone accustomed to intellectual scrutiny, but unprepared for emotional inspection. Books lined her walls in immaculate rows, the spines arranged in a system known only to her. She offered a perfunctory explanation about the porter, calling him diligent, reserved, and then adding that she had not given him more attention than politeness demanded. Yet her hands betrayed a faint tremor when she adjusted the sleeve of her cardigan, as if a thought had unsettled her just before we entered. She asked whether the investigation required her to revisit old matters. Old was spoken too delicately, as though it concealed a bruise. I noticed a photograph on her desk, turned ever so slightly away from us. A gathering of scholars, a younger Markham among them. One figure, placed near her shoulder, had been scratched out with such precision that only the silhouette remained. I did not ask. The unasked question often reveals more than the direct one. We found Julian Ware in the SCR, swirling a glass of something he could not afford. His charm was the sort that hovered just above insincerity, buoyed by debts he pretended not to carry. He recognized me with a smile too quick to be genuine. He said the porter had been a decent man, always willing to fetch a misplaced parcel or locate a forgotten key. Then he added, with studied hesitation, that the porter had lately seemed distracted, as though preoccupied by burdens that did not belong to his station. Ware's eyes flickered toward the notice board as he spoke, landing on a scrap of paper pinned askew. An advertisement for a research seminar, though the title had been partially torn away. Something in the gesture struck me, the faint recoil of a man who sees the shadow of a memory he would rather not revisit. It reminded me of a clue in a crossword where the answer hovered on the edge of recognition but refused to settle. Next was Sister Beatrice Hale, the college chaplain. Her rooms were spare, almost ascetic, yet softened by the faint scent of beeswax and old hymnals. She greeted us with a gentleness that felt genuine in a place so determinedly composed. When she spoke of the porter, her voice took on a thread of sorrow that did not belong to mere acquaintance. She described him as troubled toward the end, though she would not elaborate. Her eyes drifted off into a small wooden cross on the wall, as though seeking permission to remain silent. I asked whether the porter had confided in her. She paused long enough for the quiet to become its own answer. People come to me with their fears, she said softly. But fear is not always something I can name for others. It was a line rich in the kind of ambiguity that belongs more to confession than explanation. Our last visit was to Tom Fallow, a postgraduate student with the restless intelligence of someone who reads too much and sleeps too little. His room smelled faintly of ink and stale coffee. Papers covered every surface, covered again by the anxiety of a man drowning in his own thoughts. He admitted, almost absently, that he had admired Armitage for years, that he had studied the professor's unpublished notes with a devotion bordering on reverence. When I mentioned the porter, Fallow frowned as though trying to summon a memory he had mislaid. He said the porter had once asked him a peculiar question, something about a lecture Armitage had abandoned decades ago. Fallow couldn't recall the exact phrasing, but he remembered the tone, a curious blend of urgency and resignation. That detail lodged itself in my mind like a shard of glass. Why would a porter, long removed from academic circles, inquire about an obscure lecture no one else remembered? As we stepped out of Fallow's staircase, the bells of the college chapel tolled the hour in a voice too heavy for daylight. The stone beneath my feet felt cold, as though the quad itself had withdrawn its warmth. Lewis asked me what I made of the people we had spoken to. I told him they reminded me of variations on a theme, each one offering harmony, dissonance, or silence, but none willing to play the melody straight. The crossword clue from that morning resurfaced again. Deduction betrayed. 6 letters. The answer still eluded me, though I felt its shape forming somewhere behind the fog of half-truths and deliberate omissions. Ambiguity hung in the air like the last breath of a dying note, and I walked across the quad with the sense that St. Fridswide's had not yet shown me the darkest parts of its composition. The poem arrived the next morning, folded into an envelope with no return address. The paper creased in a manner that suggested several hesitations before finally being posted. I found it among the usual clutter of circulars and bills on my kitchen table, its stark simplicity at odds with the loud advertisements surrounding it. There were no fingerprints smudging its surface, no traces of hurried ink. Just a short, 4-line verse, written with an almost monastic restraint. And yet the rhyme, so carefully crafted, stumbled on its 3rd line, as though someone had tugged a single thread loose. I read it once, then again. Poetry has always struck me as the most honest form of deceit. It offers truths wrapped in ambiguity, promising revelation while concealing the greater part in shadow. This one was no different. Each line nudged at a memory of Armitage's lecture, the cadence familiar enough to tighten something in my chest. It felt like an echo of words he had spoken only days earlier, now warped into something darker, as though guilt had found its rhythm but lost its courage. Lewis noticed my distraction when he met me outside the station. He asked if I had slept. I told him that sleep had become a luxury recently. That was true enough. The porter's face kept intruding upon the margins of my thoughts. That wary glance, the flicker of recognition, the fear threaded through the brief moment our eyes met. Lewis asked if I thought the poem meant anything. I told him everything meant something when delivered anonymously. We went back to St. Fridswide's archives that afternoon, the corridors cold and stubbornly dim. The college had a way of dimming even natural light, as though illumination were an intrusion upon its carefully cultivated secrets. The archivist, a man with pale fingers and an expression honed through decades of politely resenting interruptions, produced a ledger from the previous week. The porter's signature appeared in narrow strokes, the handwriting steady but tense. He had checked out a folder labeled Diary Fragments, 1984. The archivist insisted the folder contained nothing of interest. Minor notes from a fellow long deceased. Lewis raised an eyebrow. Fellows are rarely minor in their own histories. The folder itself told a different story. One page was missing, cleanly removed, No tear, no jagged edge. The kind of excision performed by someone who had time, intention, and the privacy necessary to hide it. As I lifted the remaining pages, I noticed a faint indentation, the ghost of writing once present. I angled the paper toward the low winter light, revealing a few curves and horizontal strokes. A word seemed to form, though not clearly enough to claim certainty. Memory, perhaps, or mercy. Both words had shaped more tragedies than justice ever had. Lewis muttered that the porter must have seen something. I didn't answer immediately. My attention was caught by the margin notes. Small, cramped annotations, written by a younger hand decades earlier. A symbol repeated several times, a simple diagonal slash. Meaningless on its own, yet precisely the sort of mark a logician might use to indicate contradiction. The porter had underlined one of those marks. Underlined it twice. It was the only part of the folder that bore any trace of his presence. We stepped back into the cold air of the quad. The college clock marked the hour with a tone that felt heavier than its mechanism warranted. I found myself thinking of the poem again. That incorrect rhyme, deliberate, I now felt certain, mirrored the logical imbalance in the diary fragment. A line broken, a truth bent out of place. I recited the poem silently as we walked, letting its cadence settle against the faint murmur of students passing us by. The wrongness of the rhyme tugged at me, like a crossword clue mislabeled just enough to provoke irritation. As we reached the gates, Lewis asked whether I believed the poem came from someone inside the college. I told him that the style was too disciplined for an amateur, too careful to be casual. He asked if I thought it was a warning. I said it felt more like regret wearing the mask of warning. Before we parted, I glanced up at the windows of Armitage's rooms. The curtains were open that day, though the light behind them revealed nothing of the man's private world. A faint silhouette moved across the room, then disappeared. I couldn't tell if it belonged to Armitage or to someone rifling through his unfinished work. The uncertainty followed me home like a stray cat refusing to be dismissed. Later that night, I placed the poem beside my half-finished crossword. Deduction betrayed. 6 letters. The answer continued to avoid me, yet the poem's misplaced rhyme began to cast its own dim illumination. Something in its cadence, that stumble, that intentional flaw, felt like the first breach in a wall someone had spent years fortifying. Oxford murmured its secrets beneath the November rain, and I sensed that the poem was less a message than an admission no one was willing to speak aloud. It was Lewis who first suggested that we might already have the shape of the truth, though he framed it hesitantly, like a student unsure whether he'd misread the question. We were standing beneath the archway that separated the college garden from the fellows' cloisters. Afternoon light filtered through in a thin, reluctant manner, catching the faint dust that drifted from the stone above us. Lewis said that the pieces seemed to point in one direction. Ware's debts, his fear of scandal, the porter's sudden curiosity about the past. It was, he added, the kind of alignment that would satisfy most investigations. Most, but not mine. Still, I let him speak. He laid out the pattern with admirable clarity. Ware had both motive and opportunity. He had been seen wandering near the river on the night of the porter's death. He had lied, not clumsily, but with the kind of practiced ease that reveals long acquaintance with dishonesty. It was, Lewis insisted, almost elegant. A clean narrative, a neat deduction, a puzzle whose edges had begun, obligingly, to lock into place. I told him that elegance was the enemy of truth. He smiled faintly, thinking I meant it as a generalization, but I had Armitage's voice echoing in my mind. Truth is only elegant when trimmed, and something about Ware's story felt trimmed, deliberately, surgically, almost artistically. It was too smooth, too perfect. Life rarely offers such courtesy. We went to speak with Ware again. The STR was quiet at that hour, the sort of hush that lingers after the last whiskey glass has been washed and the final newspaper folded. Ware looked up from a book he was pretending to read. His eyes flickered toward the window before he composed himself. He mentioned the porter again, describing him this time as melancholy, prone to wandering thoughts. The shift in tone was subtle, but I caught it. People rarely adjust their adjectives without purpose. I asked him where he had been the night the porter died. Ware paused, as though weighing the merits of truth against the safety of invention. He finally said he had gone for a walk along the river, needing air after an argument with a colleague. When I asked which colleague, he hesitated too long for the lie to land gently. He said it didn't matter. Most arguments in Oxford, he added, were about principle or pride, and he had forgotten which sin he was guilty of that evening. Lewis looked at me as if to say that this was enough, that Ware's evasions were the final piece of the structure. But a thought nudged at me. A faint irritation, like a crossword clue slightly misprinted. Something in Ware's phrasing belonged to someone else. A turn of expression, a too precise construction, an echo of a line I'd heard not in conversation but in Armitage's lecture. I realized, with a quiet flicker of suspicion, that Ware had borrowed a sentence not from memory, but from performance. We left the SCR with Lewis convinced that we were edging towards certainty. I felt only the discomfort of false resolution. Cases sometimes present these moments. The deceptive lull where everything aligns, but only because the truth has not yet had the chance to argue back. We walked across the quad, the cold settling in deeper as the light faded. Students hurried past with books clasped to their chests, their expressions taut with exam season apprehension. I watched their hurried steps and thought of contradiction, the mark I'd found in the diary fragment, the diagonal slash meaning the argument doesn't hold. Ware's explanation sat in my mind with exactly that weight. It didn't hold. Not yet, perhaps not at all. Lewis asked what troubled me. I told him, quietly, that Ware had misquoted Tennyson. He frowned, waiting for more. I said that people in distress rarely reach for perfect verses, and when they do, they rarely misplace a line by accident. Misquotation, I added, is sometimes the purest confession. Lewis muttered that I was reading too much into it, but I could see the thought taking root anyway. He has learned over the years that the smallest linguistic trespasses often reveal the largest concealed intentions. We stopped near the chapel, where the soft glow of electric candles bled through the stained glass. I felt the poem in my pocket again, the line that faltered, the rhyme that resisted its own pattern. Imperfection can be a clue, even when disguised as elegance, perhaps especially then. Lewis asked whether Ware should be brought in formally. I shook my head. A perfect solution is often the most suspicious. The porter, I said, had discovered something fragile, something that required subtlety to understand. Ware lacked that subtlety. His lies were well dressed, but they lacked the depth of a truth someone might kill to protect. We parted in the fading light, and I returned home with the hollow certainty that we were walking along the edge of an answer that wanted to remain hidden. Ware's story sparkled with the gleam of convenience. A false solution, polished to impress, not to endure. And beneath it, faint but insistent, the real pattern stirred like a whisper, trapped between the lines of a poem written by someone desperate not to be understood too quickly. I remember walking to Helena Markham's flat, with the dull awareness of a man heading toward a conversation he had delayed for longer than he should. The evening had drawn its thin veil over Oxford, turning every street lamp into a lonely sentinel. The pavements glistened from a recent drizzle, reflecting fragments of light like memories that refused to settle. I told myself I needed her insight into Armitage's abandoned lectures, but the truth was less tidy than that. There are people whose intelligence unsettles me. Not because it threatens, but because it mirrors too closely the kind of emotional restraint I've spent years cultivating. Her door opened before I knocked. She regarded me with the faintest smile, one that didn't quite reach the eyes. She stepped aside without speaking, and I entered a room that smelled softly of old pages and red wine. Books lay everywhere, not in chaos, but in a pattern that suggested a mind incapable of leaving thoughts unfinished. She handed me a glass, as though the moment required it, and I accepted with a gratitude I didn't voice. She asked whether the investigation was progressing. Her tone carried neither curiosity nor hope, merely the weight of someone accustomed to unwelcome truths. I told her we had spoken with Ware again, that his explanations were beginning to feel rehearsed. She nodded, tracing her fingertip along the stem of her glass. "Ware likes stories," she murmured. "He enjoys the sound of himself when he believes someone is listening." Her words carried the softness of observation rather than judgment. She struck me then, as she had before, as someone who understood human frailty without ever excusing it. I asked whether she had known the porter well. She hesitated only briefly, then said that they had exchanged more words than most fellows bothered to. "He was perceptive," she said quietly. "The kind of man who noticed what others preferred to ignore." There was something in the way she said it that stirred faint discomfort. I pressed gently, asking whether the porter had come to her with concerns. She drew in a slow breath, allowing silence to stretch between us like a curtain she wasn't certain she should draw aside. "People often confide in the wrong places," she said at last. "Sometimes because they're desperate. Sometimes because they sense a truth in someone else they lack the courage to face." Her hand trembled then, very slightly, as she set her glass down. A gesture small enough to be dismissed, yet too precise to go unnoticed. That was my moment of deduction. Not a revelation, but a quiet alignment of impressions. Helena Markham feared something, not for herself, but for the ghost of a man who had drowned with more secrets than most of the living carry. I wandered toward her, shelf letting my eyes skim across the spines. A photograph rested between two worn volumes of Greek tragedy. I had seen a version of it before. The group of scholars, the scratched-out figure, but here the image was intact, a cluster of young academics, all seriousness and ambition. Helena standing a little apart, as though bracing against the future, and beside her, the porter, before he became a porter, younger, sharper, unburdened by whatever had hollowed him over the years. I asked why she kept the unaltered version. She didn't answer immediately. When she finally did, her voice had softened to something perilously close to pain. "Because I needed to remember what he once was," she said. "Not what he became, not what the college made of him." The phrasing struck me with unexpected force. What the college made of him. Not the usual lament for wasted talent, but something more specific, more personal. She spoke of Armitage then, their former closeness, the intellectual kinship that had never fully reached friendship or affection. She said the professor had always been a man who cared more for ideas than for people, and that some consequences linger longer than any lecture can justify. I asked if she believed Armitage capable of harming the porter. She shook her head slowly, turning her gaze toward the rain-blurred window. "Armitage destroys only indirectly," she whispered, "through negligence, through pride, through the belief that truth exists in isolation from those who suffer because of it." Outside, a bicycle bell chimed faintly, carried upward by the rising wind. Helena didn't look up. She kept her eyes fixed on a past I could sense pressing against her thoughts with unwelcome persistence. I finished my wine, though the taste had gone hollow. She thanked me for coming, but in her voice lay the unmistakable refrain of someone who avoided looking back because the past held too many answers she wasn't ready to articulate. As I stepped into the night, the rain began again. Thin, persistent, almost apologetic. I walked slowly, replaying her words, her gestures, the tremor in her hand. The crossword clue that had troubled me for days rose once more to the edge of comprehension. Deduction betrayed. 6 letters. It occurred to me then that betrayal isn't always the act of one person against another. Sometimes it is the quiet decision to walk away from a truth you once held too tightly. Helena had done that, and the cost of it lingered like the echo of a melody no longer sung aloud. I returned to St. Fridswide's the next morning with the uneasy sense that the college had grown more watchful overnight. The rain had finished its work in the early dawn hours, leaving the paths slick and shining, and the air smelled of wet stone and something older, the kind of scent that lingers where old truths have been disturbed. I walked toward the archives again, telling myself it was routine. But routine rarely carries the weight that pressed against my thoughts that day. Lewis met me by the chapel, clutching a file he had been reluctant to open without me. He said the registrar had located the will I'd asked about, the one belonging to the fellow whose diary fragment the porter had borrowed. He added in his careful way that the document had been amended shortly before the fellow's death, though no one had ever raised questions. People seldom question the dying, he murmured, as though he regretted the truth of it. We found a quiet corner in the library, beneath a portrait of some long-forgotten benefactor whose expression suggested perpetual disappointment. The will was brittle with age, its edges discolored, the ink faded just enough to complicate certainty, but the alteration was unmistakable. A name struck through, a beneficiary removed, a replacement added in a hand that trembled, though the stroke of the pen remained determined. The original name had belonged to the porter. The new beneficiary was Sister Beatrice Hale. Lewis exhaled in a soft, defeated way. He said it was odd, though odd felt like too gentle a word. I told him that wills rarely reflect generosity alone. They often reveal old debts, old guilt, or old sins clinging to their final hour. He asked if I believed Hale had pressured the dying fellow. I said pressure comes in many forms: confession, regret, misplaced loyalty. He frowned, then asked why the porter had been removed. I told him that removal is sometimes more significant than inheritance. As Lewis read through the amendments again, my attention drifted to a detail that had unsettled me since Helena Markham's flat: the photograph of the research group, the unaltered version. Something about the porter's younger face, his posture, perhaps, troubled me. A man on the edge of promise, not yet aware of the fault line forming beneath him. I wondered what disappointment had shaped him into the quiet, watchful figure who moved through the college corridors decades later. I told Lewis we needed to examine the college archives again. He groaned, not dramatically, but with the weariness of a man resigned to the labyrinth of academic bureaucracy. Still, he followed. The archivist greeted us with the same thin irritation he reserved for all intrusions. He led us back to the restricted section, where folders slumped against each other like tired scholars. I asked for personnel files from the years when the porter had been a student. The archivist hesitated, then fetched them, his steps slow, as though hoping delay might soften truth. Inside the file was the same photograph Helena had kept, but here the scratched-out figure was intact. The porter stood among the group, his expression caught between pride and something less easily defined. Not arrogance, not joy. A stiffness, perhaps, as though he already sensed that belonging came at a cost he had not yet counted. Lewis asked if I saw anything significant. I told him photographs. Never tell the truth. They merely freeze the moment before truth begins to unravel. But my eyes drifted to the man on the porter's other side, the fellow whose will had been altered. His smile looked forced, his shoulders tense as though he was pretending to celebrate what troubled him. A faint detail emerged then. small enough to be dismissed by anyone looking for broader clues. The fellow's hand rested not on the porter's shoulder, but just behind it, fingers slightly curled. A gesture caught halfway between support and restraint. It was the kind of unconscious betrayal a camera captures without mercy. Lewis said the porter must have meant something to the fellow once. I told him that meaning is often the root of cruelty, not affection. We turned back to the will. Lewis suggested that the removal might have been practical. Perhaps the porter had refused the inheritance. I shook my head. The handwriting told another story. Agitation, correction, a hesitation in the ink itself. I traced the indentations with my thumb, feeling the uneven rhythm of the strokes. Someone had guided that pen, or someone had demanded clarity from a dying man who lacked the strength to protest. A tunnel of thought opened before me, quiet and unwelcome. I saw the porter visiting the archives in the days before his death. I saw him reading the diary fragments, recognizing the slash mark of contradiction he'd once been taught to write. I saw him realizing that the truth he had buried decades ago was rising, slow and relentless, like a tide that had waited too long. Lewis asked if I believed the porter had confronted someone. I said confrontation can take many forms. A look, a question, a silence that lingers too long. We stepped out of the library into the pale afternoon. The college seemed to shrink back into itself, as though it sensed our progress and resented it. I told Lewis we were missing a single link, a thread connecting the will, the photograph, and the final days of a man who had tried to outrun his past. Oxford's bell tolled the hour then, deep and resonant, its echo running through the stone like a warning or a reminder. Most puzzles, I murmured, fall apart at the edges, not the center. And this puzzle, I felt it keenly now, had edges sharper than I had first imagined. There are nights in Oxford when the city feels older than its stones, as though it remembers every betrayal, every confession, every truth spoken too softly. That was the kind of night I stepped back into the lecture hall at St. Fridswide's. The building had been locked for hours, but a side door yielded with a quiet complaint, and I found myself walking through corridors that carried the faint scent of chalk and cooling radiators. The lamps cast thin amber halos along the walls, leaving the spaces between them heavy with unspoken things. I hadn't intended to return. Yet something in the will, something in the photograph, something in the porter's underlined contradiction had threaded itself into a single demand. Hear the lecture again. Not the recorded version. There wasn't one, but the version that lived in memory. In recollection, in the slips of phrasing that had unsettled me from the moment Armitage first spoke them. I sat in the same seat as before. The wood felt colder this time, as though reminding me I was trespassing into a past that wanted nothing more to do with me. The hall was utterly still. Even the air seemed to resist movement. I let my eyes adjust to the dim light and closed them slowly, letting the professor's words replay in the theater of recollection. Truth is only elegant when trimmed. That had been the line. Polished. Too polished. I whispered it aloud into the dark, and the sound felt foreign, as though I had stolen a thought that wasn't meant to be repeated. I summoned the rest of the lecture, its cadences, its hesitations. Logic as refuge, paradox as companion, the refusal to name certain students, the way Armitage had lingered on the word consequence, as though remembering one too personal to share. But it was something else that caught me, something small enough to have been ignored in daylight. He had misquoted a theorem, a basic one, a theorem he had written about decades earlier. I remembered the exact phrasing he'd used in his publication. I'd read it once, more out of curiosity than admiration. But in the lecture, he had altered a single word, and not by accident. A substitution so subtle it could have slipped past anyone not listening for fault lines. The porter had been listening. I imagined him standing at the door that day, hearing the shift, recognizing its significance because he had once lived inside Armitage's world. A younger man with promise, stripped of it by circumstance or cruelty, now returned to a past that refused to stay buried. He had understood that the misquoted line wasn't an error. It was a signal, a kind of encoded confession. I opened my eyes. The hall looked unchanged, yet something within it had shifted. A small detail nagged at me, a memory of Armitage's gestures. He had tapped his fingers against the lectern in a rhythm that now seemed deliberate. Not nervousness, not age. A pattern I had forgotten until that moment. A poem. Not the one I'd received, but something akin to it. A metrical echo disguised as absent-minded tapping. I rose slowly and walked to the lectern. The wood bore scratches, indentations from years of lectures. But one mark, faint, horizontal, looked newer. I touched it gently, feeling the grain uneven beneath my fingers. Lewis's voice drifted through my thoughts then, asking earlier whether the porter had confronted anyone. I'd said confrontation can take many forms. Now I wondered if the confrontation had happened here, silently, between a professor who wished to confess and a man who had spent his life trying to forget. I found the lecture notes tucked beneath, the lectern bound with a fraying ribbon. Most pages were blank. The few written ones were fragments, phrases without context, symbols without explanation. But one line stood alone on an otherwise empty sheet. To correct a theorem, one must first acknowledge the flaw in its foundation, not addressed to students, not addressed to the college, addressed to someone whose life had once been built on that foundation, someone whose future had been shattered when the truth became inconvenient. The porter. I sank back into the chair and felt the dark settle around me like a verdict. I saw the pattern now. Not fully, but enough to understand that the lecture had been a quiet attempt at redemption, coded in logic, masked in misquotation, hoping to reach the one person Armitage had wronged most deeply. But someone else had heard it. Someone who feared what the porter might do with the truth. Someone who had more to lose than Armitage, more to protect, more to conceal. The hall creaked softly, as though shifting its weight. A gust of night air seeped beneath the door, carrying the faint scent of damp leaves. I whispered the crossword clue again. Deduction betrayed. 6 letters. The answer hovered near the edge of thought, unwilling to step into clarity. I left the hall in silence, locking the door behind me, though the act felt redundant. The past inside that room could no longer be contained, and somewhere in the dark, the truth waited. Patient, wounded, inevitable. I've never trusted certainty. It arrives too neatly, too polished, like a story rehearsed for an audience that will not ask the right questions. But that night, walking across the quiet lawns of St. Friddeswyde's toward the chaplaincy, I felt a kind of stillness settle over me. Not certainty, but the uneasy calm that comes when the final piece slides into place, uninvited and uncelebrated. Sister Beatrice Hale had asked to see me. The message had been brief, almost abrupt, as though brevity might dilute its significance. I found her waiting beside the small chapel, its stained glass windows darkened by the hour. She stood with her hands clasped, her head slightly bowed, not in prayer but in resignation. The wind pressed lightly against her robes, giving the impression that she might dissolve into the night if I looked away for too long. She said she knew why I'd come. I told her I doubted that. People often assume confession is a matter of desire. In truth, it is usually a matter of exhaustion. She gestured toward a bench beneath the cloister. We sat, though the silence felt heavier, seated than standing. The chapel bell, unlit and unseen, offered a faint, metallic shiver whenever the wind changed direction. She asked whether I had read the fellow's will. I told her that I had. She nodded, her gaze fixed on a crack in the stone floor. She said the fellow had been a good man once before guilt had dismantled him. She said the porter had been a brilliant student before. Disappointment shaped him into someone the college could forget with ease. She spoke of the past with the odd clarity of someone who has lived too long with its consequences. I asked why the porter had been removed from the will. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the chapel door as though hoping it might open and relieve her of the burden she had carried alone. When she finally spoke, her voice held a fragile steadiness. She said the fellow had wanted to make amends, that he had chosen the porter because he had wronged him, that he had later changed his mind. Not willingly, but under pressure. I asked from whom. She closed her eyes. "Not from Armitage," she whispered. "From me." The words drifted between us like an unwelcome visitor. She explained, though explanation felt like too generous a word, that she had begged the fellow to spare the porter the pain of remembering what had been taken from him. She said the inheritance would have reopened wounds that never healed, and that she had acted out of compassion, not greed. A contradiction, perhaps, but human contradictions rarely resolve neatly. I asked whether the porter had confronted her before his death. She hesitated, then admitted that he had come to her, quietly, with a look she had not seen since he was a student. A look of someone finally recognizing that the truth had been edited out of his life by people who believed they were protecting him. She said he had found the diary fragment and understood that the fellow had been trying to say something before his mind failed completely. She didn't describe the confrontation in detail. She only said he had been trembling, that he had asked whether she had been the one who convinced the fellow to remove his name from the will, that she had said yes, and that the truth had broken something already cracked within him. I asked whether she had followed him to the river. She said she had walked after him, calling his name, but that her voice had been swallowed by the wind. She said she had seen him slip or perhaps choose not to steady himself. She said she didn't know which was true, and that the ambiguity had devoured her every day since. Her confession didn't arrive with theatrics or tears. It emerged in soft fragments, worn smooth by repetition. She wasn't asking for absolution. She wasn't even asking to be understood. She simply needed someone else to carry a sliver of the truth so she no longer held it alone. When she finished, she stood and stepped toward the chapel. She said she would speak with the college in the morning. I knew she would not. Some people walk into consequences with courage, others walk into them because they have run out of places to hide. I remained on the bench long after she disappeared inside. The air tasted of damp stone, and somewhere a fox barked, its cry thin and oddly mournful. The crossword clue returned one last time. Deduction betrayed. 6 letters. The answer arrived, then not as triumph, but as recognition. Regret. I walked through the quad slowly, feeling the case settle into the quiet corners of my memory. The proof was imperfect, incomplete, like most truths worth knowing. And Oxford, lit by a thin band of moonlight, seemed content to let the imperfection stand.